Alice woke before the birds did, in that thick dark that lies over water, before 4 in the morning. She knew the hour not by any clock, but by the particular stillness of it, the way the cabin held its breath, the way Tom's breathing beside her had not yet changed into the shallower rhythm that meant he too was near waking. She lay still a moment in the bed hole, that low cupboard of a bed built into the width of the stern, and let her eyes find the shapes of the cabin by the last red glow through the range's fire door. Overhead, close enough to touch without straightening her arm, the roof curved down to meet the cabin sides, and she could feel rather than see the brass rail above her, hung with the good horse brasses that did no work at all except catch the light and remind a woman, first thing, that some things in her life were bright and cared for. The baby, Jack, was a warm, damp weight against her hip, still deep in sleep, one fist curled by his cheek. Beyond him, in the little cross bed that folded down over the cupboard by day, Ellen slept with her knees drawn up, and beyond her again, wedged into the corner the family called the spare hole, though it held young George most nights, her youngest boy lay with his mouth open, breathing the deep, unbothered breath of a child of 5 who did not yet know what a long day was. Alice eased herself up an inch at a time, feeling for the edge of the bed with her bare foot, mindful of the cabin's iron rule. There was no room in 7 feet by 6 for a clumsy woman. Every motion aboard the Wild Rose had to be a considered one, learned by years of practice until it no longer needed thought at all. The turn of the hip that let her past Tom without waking him, the low duck beneath the shelf where the lace-edged plates stood in their rack, the flat placing of her foot to miss the loose board that knocked when trodden wrong. She had grown up in a house on dry land, a cottage with 4 rooms and a garden behind it, and she still marveled sometimes at how completely her body had learned this smaller geography, the way water fits itself to its channel. She struck a match against the box kept dry in its tin above the range, and the small flare of it showed her the cabin whole for a heartbeat. The painted cupboard doors with their roses, red and pink and improbably full-blown, twined with green leaves that no rose had ever truly worn, and beside them a painted castle on a green hill, towers too slender to stand, a scene no one aboard had ever seen, and no one aboard doubted was somewhere real. Tom's father had painted those doors, and his father's hand had not been unsteady even at the end of his working years. The roses were even, the brush strokes sure, and Alice touched the door frame now from habit, the way she touched it every morning before opening it to reach the kindling. She fed the fire slowly, coal first laid in the night, before wrapped close so it should not damp. Then a handful of the thin, dry kindling Tom split each evening from offcuts bought cheap at the wharves. The range was small, black-leaded to a shine that caught what little light there was, no bigger than a large cupboard, and it did the work of warming the cabin, cooking every meal, and drying every stocking wet from a lock side, all from a firebox not much larger than a hat box. She had blacked it herself only 2 days past, working the polish into every seam until her knuckles ached, because a woman's cabin was known up and down the cut by the state of its range and its brasses, and Alice did not care to be known for anything less than shining. The kindling caught with its small dry crackle, a sound so ordinary to her now that she scarcely marked it, except as the first proof the day had properly begun. Smoke found its way up the chimney in a thin gray thread, and through the 2 inches of open porthole above the bedhole, She caught the cold outside air meeting the fire's warmth, a smell of coal smoke and frost, and beneath it, the low mineral breath of the canal itself, mud and reed and still water, a smell she had stopped noticing as a smell at all sometime in her second year aboard, the way a person stops smelling their own house, except that now, waking, it came to her fresh each time. The boat's own particular scent of tar and rope and stored cargo, and beneath everything else, faint and always there, coal dust settled into every crack of wood the width of the hold away. She filled the kettle from the water can kept just inside the cabin door. They had topped it at a pump by lock the evening before, and it was cold enough now to numb her fingers through the handle and set it on the hob to find its heat. While it worked itself toward the boil, she dressed in the dark by feel. Her working skirt and blouse hung on their peg, where damp never quite left them even in high summer. A shawl crossed over her chest and knotted at the back the way her mother had taught her, sensible and warm and out of the way of her hands. She pinned her hair back hard enough that it would hold through a day of stooping and lifting, and only then, dressed and ready to be useful, did she let herself feel the cold properly, the cabin floor cool under her stockinged feet, the brass door handle sharp with chill when her fingers found it, the whole boat holding the night's cold in its timbers, the way it held the day's heat in summer, faithfully, without complaint. Outside, she stood a moment on the little back deck, no bigger than a hearthrug, and let the cold, full air meet her face. The sky over the cut was the deep blue-black that comes an hour before dawn, not yet showing any hint of gray at its edge, and stars still stood clear above the black shapes of the trees along the bank. All along the towpath the world was silent, but for the small sounds that told her other boats lay near, a soft knock of a fender against another hull somewhere ahead, the huff of a horse shifting its feet in the picketed grass, water lapping low and constant against 70 feet of iron-bound timber, her own boat and every boat near it, breathing the same slow breath of settled water. She could just make out, moored a little way ahead, the shape of the Endeavor, another number one's boat, and beyond that, the dark bulk of a company pair tied for the night at the wharf, its cargo of pottery crates roped down under sheet and waiting, like her own boat's cargo of coal, for the day's work to begin. She breathed it in, cold coal smoke, wet grass, the particular green smell of a canal at first light that was neither quite river nor quite pond, but something the years of traffic and towpath and lock had made all its own, and then went back down into the warm smell of the cabin, where the kettle had begun at last its low complaining hiss, and where Tom's eyes had opened in the dark to find her. He did not say good morning. Boatmen did not, in Alice's experience, waste words on things the day would prove for itself soon enough. He only reached up a hand and touched Jack's small back, where the baby lay against the pillow, a brief checking touch, and then swung his legs down from the bed hole with the particular economy of a man who had done the same thing in the same space every morning of his working life and saw no reason to do it anyway but the shortest one. He was a broad man, made broader by the cabin around him, his shoulders nearly brushing the low roof when he stood, and he dressed as she had, by feel, pulling his boots on last and lacing them by the small light of the range's open door. "Frost on the tow line," he said, and went up the steps to look at the horse. Alice said about the kettle, and the porridge oats kept dry in their tin, and behind her, Unbidden by any word, Ellen stirred in the crossbed, roused by the small sounds of the morning, the way she was roused every morning. 11 years old, and already possessed of a boat child's instinct for knowing, even asleep when the working day had started without her. She sat up, rubbing her eyes, her plait come half undone in the night, and reached automatically for her boots before she had even properly opened her eyes, because a boat child learned early that mornings did not wait, and that whatever she wanted from sleep, the horse wanted his feed first, and the cut wanted the boat moving with the light. "Is it cold out?" Ellen said, not really a question, more a thing said to test whether her voice worked yet. "Bitter," said Alice. "Get your shawl on before you go up." Ellen did, wrapping herself in the gray wool without complaint, because complaint was another thing that boat children learned early was of no particular use. She went up the steps after her father, out into the last of the dark, to see to Boxer, the bay gelding who pulled the Wild Rose along 7 or 8 or occasionally 10 miles of towpath a day, and who knew Ellen's step on the plank so well that Alice, listening from below, heard the horse's soft answering whicker before she heard her daughter's voice at all. George slept on a few minutes longer in the spare hole, worn out as 5-year-olds are worn out by even a day of watching, and Alice let him, moving quietly now around the small space to lay the table down from its hinge on the cabin wall, to set out the 3 bowls and 1 small dish for Jack's portion, to stir the oats into the pot of water just come to the boil. The cabin filled slowly with the smell of porridge and coal smoke, and the last of the night's tallow candle guttering in its sconce, and outside on the towpath she heard Tom's low voice speaking to the horse, not words exactly, just the particular murmuring tone a boatman uses on a cold morning to a beast who has pulled his boat faithfully for years, and asks in return only his feed, his water, and a kind hand laid along his neck before the day's collar goes on. By the time the sky had lightened from black to the deep gray blue that comes just before proper dawn, the whole small crew of the Wild Rose was awake and moving through the ordinary business of getting itself ready to travel, each of them doing the piece of the morning that was theirs to do, the way they had done it in one order or another every working morning that Alice could now remember. George woke to the smell of porridge, as he woke most mornings, and came stumbling up out of the spare hole with his hair on end and one stocking already lost somewhere in the blankets. Alice found it for him without needing to look. Her hand, knowing the shape of the bedhole better than her eyes could have told her in that light, and pulled it onto his foot herself while he leaned against her shoulder, still half in sleep, his small warm weight familiar and dear against her arm, the way each of her children's weights were familiar and dear, each one different, each one known. They ate standing, mostly, or perched on the edges of the side bench, because the table let down from the wall took up what little floor the cabin had to spare, and a family of 5 did not all sit to it at once, except of an evening when the boat was moored and the day's work behind them. Tom ate his porridge in 3 or 4 spoonfuls, standing in the hatchway with one eye already on the gray light over the water, a man impatient not from any temper, but from the plain fact that a boat not moving was a boat earning nothing, and coal did not carry itself the 11 miles to the wharf at Standish, where it was owed by Thursday next. Jack was propped in Alice's lap and fed by careful spoonfuls between her own mouthfuls. Patient work, the porridge blown cool first and offered slow, and Ellen ate hers quickly and neatly, the way she did everything now, a girl who had learned to hurry without ever seeming to rush. Boxers had his nose bag, Tom said, over the rim of his mug of strong dark tea, and Ellen's greased the swingle tree where it creaked yesterday. We'll want to make Deeping Lock by 8 if the flight isn't held. Was it held Tuesday? Alice asked, though she knew the answer, because asking was its own kind of conversation between them, a way of tying the day's plan together out loud before the day itself untied it in whatever way it chose. Company pair ahead of us, going down empty. We'll not lose above the half hour. He said it without any weight of complaint, the way he said most things about the working of the cut. Locks were locks, and a man who minded waiting his turn behind another boat had chosen the wrong trade, for the cut belonged to everyone who paid their tolls, and no one crossed another boater's fair turn at a lock, not in the Wild Rose's stretch of water, not if he wanted a civil word from any boatman he might meet again next month or next year, which he surely would, for the cut was a long road, but a narrow world, and everyone on it knew everyone else by boat and by name inside 2 or 3 seasons. Outside, full light was coming up gray and soft over the water meadows, the mist still lying along the surface of the cut in long, low drifts that would burn off within the hour, and Ellen went forward along the gunwale, sure-footed as a cat along the narrow plank that ran the length of the cargo hold, out to where Boxer stood harnessed and blowing steam from his nostrils into the cold air, his breath a small private fog all his own. She checked the traces, the leather worn soft and dark with years of handling, checked the collar sat well against his shoulders and had not slipped in the night's shifting, and unclipped the picket line that had held him to graze the bank grass while the family slept. "Come up then," she told him, and he came without any pulling needed, following the sound of her voice as he had followed it since he was broken to the towpath 4 years before, when Ellen herself had been small enough that her father still lifted her up onto his shoulders to walk the plank at his side. Now she walked alone ahead of the horse, her boots finding the worn path with the same unthinking sureness. Her mother's hands found the cabin's dark corners, and the long line paid out behind her from the mast, 70 feet and more of stout rope running from the horse's collar to the stem of the boat, and took up its slow first strain. Tom stood at the tiller, with the long wooden arm of it warm even in the cold morning from his own gloved hand, and gave the signal, a low word to Ellen, a small lean of his weight against the tiller, and the Wild Rose, 70 feet of oak and elm, loaded low in the water with better than 20 tons of coal under her tarpaulin sheets, began, with the faint groan of rope taking strain and the small lap and gurgle of water parting at her bow, to move. There is no sound in the world, Alice thought, standing in the hatchway with Jack against her hip to watch the bank begin its slow slide past, quite like a narrowboat getting under way of a cold morning. It was not fast. Nothing on the cut was fast, 3 miles in the hour if the water was kind and the boat not too deep loaded, sometimes less. But it had a steadiness to it that no other motion she knew could match, a low patient forward glide that came from the horse's steady walk, and nothing else, no engine, no haste, just Boxer's 4 legs finding their rhythm on the path, and the water yielding ahead of the bow and closing again behind the stern in a long, unhurried wake that smoothed itself flat again within 100 yards, as though the boat had never passed that way at all. She went below again once the boat had settled into its pace, because a moving boat did not mean an idle mother, and there was washing up to be done in the small tin bowl kept for it, and the beds to be put right, cross bed folded back up against the wall, bed hole covers straightened, every loose thing in the cabin stowed or wedged or hung on its proper hook, for a cabin 7 feet by 6 held nothing that was not in its place, could hold nothing that was not. And Alice moved through the small chores with the boat's gentle rock, working with her rather than against her, an old rhythm her body had long since stopped questioning. Jack she set in the low wooden box that served him for a cradle by day, wedged snug against the cupboard so the boat's motion should not tip him, and gave him the wooden spoon he liked to gum and bang against the box's edge, a small percussion under everything else, tap and tap and tap, content. George she kept near her at first, minding him at his own request to help dry the bowls, though his help consisted mostly of standing very close and asking questions. Why did the water go green there and blue further on? Why did the swans not seem to mind the boat? Why was the towpath sometimes on the left side of the cut and sometimes on the right? Questions Alice answered as best she could between wringing out the dishcloth and setting the bowls back in the rack, because a boat mother learned to do 3 things with her hands and answer a 4th thing with her mouth, all at once, all day, and thought no more of it than a farmer's wife thought of milking with her eyes half shut. Outside, the mist had begun to lift off the water in slow smoking curls, and the sun, not yet risen high enough to be seen over the line of alders along the bank, showed itself first only as a paling of the sky in the east, a soft peach-gray warmth spreading up from beneath the horizon. Herons stood in the shallows here and there, gray and motionless as fence posts, until the boat came near enough to trouble them, when they would lift off with a slow, heavy beat of wings and resettle further along, only to be disturbed again a few minutes later, when the wild rose caught them up once more, over and over, the same heron or another exactly like it, the whole length of that stretch of water. They passed the Endeavor at her mooring, not yet underway. Old Sam Kettle stood on her back deck with a mug of tea in his hand and lifting it in silent greeting as the Wild Rose went by, and Tom lifted 2 fingers off the tiller in answer, and that was the whole of the exchange, for boatmen did not stop to talk of a morning any more than they wasted words on greetings, though later in the day, tied up alongside at some lock or wharf, there might be a proper conversation. News passed along the cut from boat to boat, the way news had always traveled on that slow water. A wedding at Brownstone, a good price for lime at the far end, a lock-keeper's daughter married last month to a boy off a Pickford's boat. The water meadows gave way by degrees to hedgerow, and then to the first low walls of a village not yet properly woken. Chimneys just beginning to send up their own thin threads of smoke to join the mist, a dog barking somewhere behind a cottage unseen. Ellen walked on ahead with the horse, her small figure steady on the path, shawl wrapped close, and called back now and then some small things she had seen, a heron, a moorhen's nest low in the reeds, a rabbit gone to ground at the sound of hooves, and Alice moving between the range and the cradle and George's endless soft questions, answered her daughter's calls with half her attention, and gave the other half to the porridge pot now needing scouring, and found, as she nearly always found in these first working hours of the day, a kind of settled contentment in it, the small world of the boat, moving forward at its unhurried pace through a country just waking around it, everything in its place, everything known. The first lock of the Deeping Flight came into sight a little after 7, its black gates squat and dripping against the pale morning, and Tom called Ellen back to walk the horse only to the lock's edge before she let him graze a moment on the bank grass. For a horse pulling a boat into a locked chamber was a horse in the wrong place entirely, and the whole business of locking through was, for a few minutes, work done by hand and by water alone. No horse wanted at all. Ellen ran ahead with the windlass, the small iron crank that had hung at her waist from a loop of leather, since she was old enough to be trusted with it, out onto the lock landing, past the neat cottage garden that stood beside every lock on this stretch, its beds of cabbages and row of runner beans just coming into leaf, its gate freshly whitewashed, the lock-keeper's wife already out feeding a scatter of hens in the yard. Alice knew her by sight, Mrs. Iliff, a broad, cheerful woman who grew, Alice always thought, the finest sweet peas on the whole cut. Trained up a row of hazel poles against the cottage wall, though it was too early yet for them to show more than their first curling shoots. "Mornin', Ellen, love," Mrs. Iliff called from her yard. "Tell your mother I've eggs to spare if she wants to stop a moment on your way back." "I will," Ellen called back, already fitting the windlass to the spindle of the near paddle, and set to winding. The work of a lock was, to Alice's eye, one of the plainest and most satisfying pieces of the whole day's labor, a thing that asked nothing but a strong arm and a patient rhythm, and gave back every time exactly what it promised. Ellen wound the paddle up slow and steady, the iron ratchet clicking under the windlass with each turn, and the water below the top gate began to rush and boil in through the culvert, white water churning up from beneath the gate's dark timbers and swirling out across the chamber. The wild rose, brought gently in against the top gate by Tom's careful hand, rode the surge as it always did, dipping a little and then settling, patient as the boat itself was patient, into the slow business of being lowered. Tom stood on the gate beam once the lower paddles were wound down and shut, leaning his whole weight into the great oak balance beam with the ease of a man who had leaned on 10,000 such beams, and the gate swung shut with the low groan and thud of old wood meeting. Old wood, a sound Alice had come to love without ever quite deciding to. Then to the lower gate, and Ellen there already with the windlass fitted to the far paddle, winding it up in her turn while her father crossed to wind the near one, and the water in the chamber began, with a great slow sucking swirl, to fall. Alice watched it from the cabin roof where she had come up to keep an eye on things, George beside her in his usual spot, settled and entirely unbothered, the pair of them watching the black walls of the chamber rise slowly up around the boat as the water inside it fell, the wild rose settling deeper into the stone-sided chamber until the top of the gate stood high above the cabin roof, and the whole world beyond had vanished from George's sight but for a strip of gray sky overhead. It took perhaps 10 minutes, start to finish, the water finding its own level with a last low gurgle, and then the lower gates swung open under Tom's shoulder, and the wild rose nosed forward and out, down onto the lower stretch of water, some 6 or 8 feet below where she had entered, the whole business done as it was done a dozen times a day, without drama, without haste, a plain transaction between boat and water and gate. The family had long since stopped remarking on, except to note, as Tom did now, that the gate hinge had wanted re-greasing, a small thing to mention to the lock-keeper on their way back through in a fortnight's time. There were 4 locks in the Deeping Flight that morning, each one much like the last, and Alice found in their repetition not tedium, but a kind of comfort. The same motions performed again and again. Windlass fitted, paddle wound, gate leaned open, boat entered, paddle wound the other way, gate leaned shut, and the family moved through them together with the unspoken coordination of people who had done this work as a unit for years. Ellen running ahead to set the paddles, Tom minding the tiller and the gates, Alice keeping the younger two safe and ready with a cup of water or a dry mitten as wanted. At the third lock, they found another boat waiting to come up as they went down. The Countess, a company boat out of Loughborough with a cargo of lime under her sheets. Her boatman, a thick-set man named Perrin, whom Tom had known since before either of them were married. The two boats passed close in the narrow approach, and there was time, while Ellen and the Countess's own boy worked the gates between them for the two men to exchange a few words across the water. The pound above Deeping, running low this week, a mutual acquaintance's boat gone in for repainting near Braunston, the toll office having raised its rates again, a farthing a ton, grumbled over amiably as a fact of life no more alterable than the weather. Alice, from the cabin roof, caught Mrs. Perrin's eye across the narrowing gap of water, and the two of them exchanged the particular nod that passed between boat women who lived lives so alike and met so briefly, a nod that said, without need of words, "I see you, I wish you a fair day." And then the boats were past each other, and the moment folded itself away behind them, one more small thread in the long weave of acquaintance that ran the length of the cut. By the time the flight was behind them, the sun stood properly up over the hedgerows, pale and without much warmth, yet but bright enough to silver the water ahead of the bow, and Ellen came back to walk beside her mother a stretch, leaving the horse to plod on alone a moment along a straight, clear reach, with no other traffic in sight, the long tow line slack enough to let him wander a little without consequence, cropping now and then at a tuft of grass grown close to the path. "Mrs. Iliff said she'd eggs to spare," Ellen reminded her mother. "So she did, and I've a shilling put by for them. Run and fetch a dozen if she'll sell them, and mind you, thank her properly." Alice pressed the coin into her daughter's palm, and Ellen was off again, back along the towpath at a light trot toward the lock cottage they had left behind, her boots sure on the worn path, her shawl come loose at one corner and flying a little as she ran, a girl entirely at home in the only world she had ever properly known, one lock and one towpath, and one boat at a time. By mid-morning, the sun had climbed high enough to lie warm along the cabin roof, and Alice, with the eggs wrapped safe in a cloth in the cupboard and Jack asleep at last in his box, brought out the tin of black lead and the soft rags kept for the brasswork, and settled herself on the back deck to the day's polishing. It was not strictly a chore that wanted doing every day. A careful woman need only do it every second or third. But Alice liked the doing of it, liked the way the horse brasses along the cabin rail and the great gleaming rings around the chimney gave back, under a patient rag, a shine that seemed to her a kind of answer to the coal dust and the mud and the gray business of hauling cargo, proof that a boat could be worked hard and still be beautiful, that a family could live in 7 feet of cabin and still keep something in their lives simply because it caught the light well. She worked with Jack's box wedged by her feet and one eye on George, who sat cross-legged nearby with a length of old rope he was teaching himself to splice, tongue caught between his teeth, undoing his own clumsy work and starting again without complaint. The boat moved on beneath them all the while, Ellen's small figure steady on the path ahead with the horse, the water sliding by dark green and slow, willows trailing their new leaves along the banks, moorhens scattering into the reeds at the boat's approach and scolding softly from cover. Alice rubbed the polish into the brass with small firm circles, working it into every scroll and curl of the horse brass's patterns. A sunburst, a crescent moon, a running fox, each one collected over the years of her marriage, bought cheap from a hawker's cart, or given by Tom on some anniversary he never said much of remembering, and buffed each one after with a dry cloth until it threw back the sun in a hard, bright point of light. The smell of the polish was sharp and not unpleasant, a smell she associated now with quiet, mid-morning hours like this one, the small domestic satisfaction of watching something dull come up bright beneath her own hands. Dinner she began before noon, because a moving boat's cook could not wait for a clock to strike the hour the way a housebound cook might, not when the range was small and slow, and a family's dinner wanted a good hour's honest simmering. She had a piece of bacon, not much, kept from the week's shopping at the last town, and this she cut into the pot with onions and the last of a sack of potatoes bought a fortnight since, and a handful of split peas set to soak since the night before, all of it going in together to make the kind of thick, warming, all-in-one dinner that every boatwoman on the cut knew how to make from whatever the week's purse and the week's larder allowed, for there was no market close at hand most days, and no larder bigger than 2 cupboards, and a woman who could not stretch a small piece of meat across a family's dinner with onions and peas, and whatever green stuff she'd gathered from a hedge bank was not thought much of, up and down the water. The smell of it filled the cabin as the morning wore toward noon, meaty and oniony and rich, mixing with the cold smoke from the range and the ever-present mineral breath of the water outside, and George abandoned his rope splicing to hang about the cabin door, asking when dinner would be ready in the particular aggrieved tone of a boy whose stomach ran well ahead of the pot's own timetable. "When it's ready," Alice told him, which was the answer her own mother had given her, and stirred the pot again, and sent him back up to watch for the toll office they were nearing, which occupied him well enough, for a toll office was a thing worth watching. A low building set right at the water's edge, where the cut narrowed and the boats were made to pass one at a time. The gauger came out to meet them as Tom brought the Wild Rose in against the measuring stop, a lean, patient man in a bowler hat gone soft with weather, who read off the depth the boat sat at against the marks painted on her side, a scale set when she was new that told a practiced eye exactly what weight of cargo she carried by how deep she rode, and noted the figure in a ledger bound in oilcloth against the wet. It was a business of a very few minutes, the toll paid from the tin box Tom kept under the cabin steps, a word or two about the water low at Brindley's Reach, on account of the dry spell, best keep to the deep channel, and then the Wild Rose was through and on her way again, Boxer taking up the strain with the unbothered patience of a horse who had waited at that same stop 100 times before. They came to the tunnel a little after 1, its black mouth cut square into the hillside ahead, and here the whole shape of the day's travel changed for a stretch of nearly half a mile, for no horse walked through a tunnel, there being no towpath cut inside the hill, and so Boxer was led round and over the top by the road to be met again at the tunnel's far mouth, and the boat itself was worked through by legging, an old method Alice had watched 100 times and still found strange and wonderful in its own plain way. Tom took the near side, and a tunnel man they hired for the purpose, a wiry fellow who made his whole living walking boats through that black half-mile of stone, took the other, both of them lying back along boards laid out from the cabin roof over the boat side, their boots braced flat against the dripping brick walls, and walked the wild rows forward, foot by foot, legs working in a slow, steady rhythm, the boat gliding ahead at barely more than a walking pace. The dark inside was a dark Alice had never quite grown used to, complete but for the small lantern hung at the bow, and every drip of water off the roof and every creak of the boat's timbers came back doubled and trebled by the close stone walls, echoing away until it was swallowed in the blackness ahead. She kept the children close beside her for the crossing, from the plain, companionable sense of a mother keeping her brood together in the dark, and told George, who found the tunnel the most thrilling quarter hour of any day it fell on, to listen for the drip of water and count the seconds between each one, a game that kept him happily occupied the whole slow crossing, while the lantern's small light bobbed at the bow, and somewhere far ahead a paling of gray showed at last where the tunnel's mouth let the daylight back in. They came out into full afternoon sun, with the particular blinking relief of anyone stepping from a dark room into a bright one. The tunnel man paid his few coppers and left to walk back for his next boat, and Boxer waiting patient in the daylight where the road had brought him round, glad by every sign of his ears to see Ellen come to fetch him back to his collar and his work. Dinner, when it came at last, was eaten much as breakfast had been, in shifts and snatches, Tom taking his bowl at the tiller and eating one-handed while he steered, Alice feeding Jack his own softened portion between mouthfuls of her own, Ellen and George perched together on the side bench with their bowls balanced on their knees, and though it was not eaten the way a house-bound family might sit to it, around a table, unhurried, it was eaten with the same plain satisfaction, the pot scraped near empty, the bread mopping up what the spoons had missed, and afterward a kind of easy quiet settled over the boat. The sun warm now and the cut running wide and calm through open pasture where cattle stood knee-deep in the shade and barely lifted their heads to watch the wild rows pass. The afternoon settled into its own long, unhurried rhythm, the kind of stretch of the day Alice had come, over the years, to value most of all, when the morning's work of locks and toll and tunnel lay behind them, and the evening's work of mooring and settling lay still some hours ahead, and there was nothing to be done but keep the boat moving, and the family fed and occupied, and let the miles go by beneath them at Boxer's own steady walking pace. She brought her mending out onto the cabin roof, a basket of it always waiting, Tom's shirts wanting a button here and a seam restitched there, one of George's stockings worn through at the heel, and sat in the warm sun with her needle finding its own rhythm in and out, while the hedgerows slid past on either side, thick with hawthorn coming into leaf, and the water ahead lay flat and bright, but for the small ripples of the boat's own gentle wake. George had tired of his rope by then and came to sit near her, and she set him to winding a ball of wool from a skein she held stretched between her hands, a task he took to with great seriousness, his small tongue caught between his teeth again in concentration, and between the two of them, mother's needle and son's careful winding, the basket emptied itself slowly of its mending, while the afternoon light began by degrees too slow to notice at any one moment, to soften and lengthen and turn from the hard, bright white of midday toward something warmer. They passed other boats through the afternoon, a company pair heavy loaded with timber, riding low and slow, its boatman lifting a hand in the same brief greeting Tom had given Sam Kettle that morning, and later a light boat running empty back toward the coal fields, its horse trotting rather than walking, for an empty boat asked far less of a horse than a loaded one, which struck Alice as its own small oddity on a stretch of water where hurry was so rarely called for. They passed a lock or two more, smaller flights than the mornings, worked through with the same easy, unremarked competence, no more remarkable to any of them than the opening of a garden gate. By 4, they had come to a stretch Alice knew well, a village called Ashcott, where the cut ran close by a row of cottages, and a public house stood right at the water's edge, its sign a leaping fish, badly repainted some years back, and gone a little blistered since, creaking on its bracket in the light afternoon breeze. Tom brought the boat in against the towpath here, not to stop long, only to let Boxer drink from the trough kept for the purpose outside the pub stable yard, and to allow himself, as he did most days at about this hour, a few minutes' talk with whoever else might be standing about the yard, boatmen from other craft moored nearby or waiting their turn at a lock further on, exchanging the same small currency of news that had passed between him and Perrin that morning. A lock-keeper retiring, a good load of grain to be had at the mill 2 days on, a wedding, a christening, the ordinary weave of a working world that ran the whole length of the cut and bound every boatman on it into something not quite a family and not quite a trade guild, but partaking a little of both. Alice did not go into the pub itself, that not being a place she had much cause or wish to visit, but she took the chance to walk a few minutes on solid ground with Jack on her hip and George's hand in hers, glad of the stretch after so many hours confined to boat and bank, and bought a twist of tea and a small screw of sugar from the little shop set into the front room of a cottage nearby, the kind of shop that served every boat family passing that stretch of water, and stocked accordingly. Tea, sugar, candles, a little cheese, bootlaces, the small unglamorous necessities of a life lived mostly afloat. The shopkeeper, an elderly woman with spectacles pushed up into gray hair, knew Alice a little from past passings, and asked after the children by name, and Alice answered her questions and asked her own in turn. The same slow, easy exchange of news that ran everywhere along the cut that day, in toll offices and lock cottages and cottage doorways, a whole world's worth of small talk carried up and down the water by boat families who saw each other only a few times a season and remembered all the same each other's names and each other's children. Boxer refreshed, and Tom's talk concluded, they were underway again within the half-hour, the sun now beginning its long, slow decline toward the hedgerows in the west, throwing the shadows of the trees out long and thin across the water, turning the cut surface from its midday bright blue-green to a deeper, quieter gold. Ellen had grown tired by this stage, as a girl who had risen before dawn and walked a good portion of a dozen miles might be expected to grow tired, and Tom took the horse's lead himself for the last hour, sending his daughter back to sit a while on the cabin roof with her mother, her legs swinging over the side, her shawl pulled close against the evening's first faint chill. "Will we moor at Hollow Bridge tonight?" Ellen asked, leaning her head briefly, in a rare unguarded moment, against her mother's shoulder. "If the light holds that far. Your father wants Standish by tomorrow midday, and Hollow Bridge leaves us a fair morning's run." Ellen said nothing more to that, only watched the bank go by with the particular contented tiredness of a child near the good end of a long day. And Alice, feeling her daughter's weight settle against her, thought, as she often thought at this hour, how strange and how entirely unremarkable it was that this, a boat, a towpath, a horse, a strip of water running on ahead through fields and villages and beneath low bridges toward a wharf 2 days off, should be the whole known world her children were growing up inside, the only kind of childhood any of the three of them had ever had or ever would have, and how, strange as it might look to a stranger glancing down from a bridge as they passed beneath it, it did not feel to her, sitting there with the sun going gold and her daughter's head against her shoulder, like any kind of hardship at all, but only like a life lived the way it was lived, with its own particular rhythms and satisfactions, no better and no worse, she thought, than any other. They came to Hollow Bridge a little after 6, the light still holding gold and low, but with an evening softness now, midges rising in small clouds above the water beneath the willows, and Tom brought the wild rose in against the bank in the wide mooring below the bridge's arch, a spot he knew well, grass enough for Boxer and a firm bank for the mooring pins, no other boat there before them, though the flattened grass and worn patch by the old oak showed it a well-used stopping place on this stretch. The evening's work, once the boat lay still, was its own small flurry of ordinary business. Tom drove the mooring pins with the flat of the maul, 2 sharp blows each, the sound ringing out across the quiet evening water and startling a moor-hen into a scolding retreat among the reeds, and made the lines fast fore and aft with the same unhurried competence he brought to every piece of his working day. Ellen led Boxer along the bank to the patch of good grass a little further on, where a low fence and a water trough marked out a spot boat families had used to picket their horses for longer than anyone could rightly say, and there she rubbed him down with a handful of straw, checked his feet for any stone picked up in the day's walking, found none, and settled his nose-bag over his head with the last of the day's oats, and stood a while with her hand along his warm neck while he ate, the two of them alone together in the softening light, the horse's huge patient breathing the only sound beside the evening bird-song starting up in the hedgerow. Alice, meanwhile, had the range built up again for the evening's cooking, and the smell of it, bacon, fat, and onions again, with what remained of the morning's peas stretched further with a handful of barley, began to fill the cabin and drift out through the open hatch into the cooling evening air, mixing there with the smell of the reeds and the willows and the first cool, damp breath of evening rising off the water, that particular canal evening smell she had known now for 6 years, and would, she sometimes thought, know in her sleep for the rest of her life, however long a life that turned out to be. Jack, wakeful now after his long afternoon sleep, sat propped against cushions on the side bench and watched his mother's every movement with the round, solemn attention of a baby not yet a year old, and George, his energy returned with the evening coolness after the drowsy warmth of the afternoon, ran a last errand or two along the bank, fetching water from the trough, gathering a small armful of dry sticks from beneath the oak to add to the morning's kindling store. Supper eaten properly this time, all together, the table let down fully from the wall for the one meal of the day that allowed it, was a quieter, slower affair than the day's other meals, eaten by the light of a single candle as the last of the gold outside faded to the deep blue-black of full evening. Tom talked more at supper than he had all day, telling of the news picked up at Ashcott, of a boat up for sale at Braunston cheap on account of the ironwork wanting attention, a bit of gossip about a lock-keeper's dispute over a garden boundary running on now above a year with no sign of ending, and Ellen listened with the frank interest of a girl old enough to care about the doings of the wider world of the cut, while George grew heavy-eyed over his bowl before the meal was properly finished, his spoon slowing, his head beginning to nod. After supper, while Tom went out to check the mooring lines once more and see Boxer settled for the night, tethered close enough that his familiar shifting and huffing would be audible through the cabin walls, a small assurance of the horse's well-being Alice found oddly comforting to her own rest. She set about the last small business of the day. She washed the supper things in the tin bowl by candlelight, stacked the plates back in their rack, lace-edged and gleaming faintly, wiped down the drop table before folding it flat against the wall, and swept the day's crumbs and coal dust out through the cabin door, because a boat cabin, however hard worked through however long a day, was put right again each night before its family slept. And there was no room aboard the Wild Rose, none at all, for a thing to sit long out of its place. George she undressed half asleep already, his head lolling against her shoulder as she worked his small arms free of his jersey, and settled him into the spare hole with the blanket tucked close under his chin, and he was properly asleep, she thought, before she had even finished the tucking, his breathing gone deep, and even in the space of a few short minutes, worn through by a day of watching and running and winding wool and asking his endless patient questions of a world that answered him mostly with kindness. Ellen took a little longer to settle, old enough to want a few minutes of quiet before sleep took her, and Alice sat with her a while on the edge of the cross-bed once it was folded down, brushing out her daughter's hair by the candle's last light, the two of them talking low so as not to wake George, of small things, whether Mrs. Iliff's sweet peas would be in flower by the time they came back through the deeping flight, whether Boxer's near front shoe wanted looking at by the farrier at Standish. Ellen's eyes grew heavy under the slow strokes of the brush, and before very long she too had curled down into her own corner of the bed, her small, tired body finally still after a day that had asked a great deal of it and been given, without complaint, everything it asked for. Tom came below once the boat was fully dark, but for the one candle and the range's low red glow, having seen the mooring lines fast and the tarpaulin sheets over the coal cargo tightened against the night's coming damp, and he and Alice sat together a short while in the cabin's small remaining space, not talking much, only the easy silence of two people who had worked the same long stretch of hours side by side and found at the end of it that they had done what the day required of them. He banked the range low for the night, enough heat kept in to take the worst of the chill off by morning, and blew out the candle, and the cabin fell into that particular thick dark it wore each night, broken only by the small red glow through the fire door, the same glow Alice had woken to that morning, come now full circle. She settled herself into the bed-hole with Jack once more warm against her hip, his breathing already slow and even, and lay a moment listening to the sounds of the boat at rest, water lapping soft against the hull, Boxer shifting his weight on the bank with a low huff and the faint jingle of his tether, the wind stirring gently in the willows overhead, a distant owl calling once, twice, across the dark fields, and beneath it all the small creak and settle of 70 feet of loaded timber finding its ease against the water that held it. Tom's breathing beside her deepened by slow degrees into sleep, and the boat rocked almost imperceptibly in whatever small current the night breeze pushed against it, a motion so familiar now that she no longer felt it as motion at all, but only as a kind of stillness. The stillness of a family comes safely to the end of a day's travel, moored fast, fed, settled, every one of them where they belonged. Alice closed her eyes and let the boat's slow rocking carry her down, at last, into her own sleep.